And we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new edition of Naviar Virtual, our online event. Today, I have with me Jason, also known as Bassling, as I remember from your first entries to the haiku challenge. I think back in 2013. Yeah. You told me when we were talking about it earlier that your first entry was the 17th entry, the 17th haiku challenge. Is that right?
I think there was one a little earlier that was the Disquiet Hunto had shared, because that was my introduction to Naviar when Mark shared one of your prompts with his community. And my interest in haiku suddenly was like, wow, this is a great entry point to being prompted to make music.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, we're talking. Well, in a couple of weeks, I think we're gonna have our 400th haiku challenge. So, as you can see, Jason and I go a long way back. In 2014, Jason took part in a project in a sound installation I curated for an exhibition in London called State of Origin. And then in 2017, Jason and I collaborated again for an exhibition in Narrandera, and again curated by Jason this time, and Naviar Records participated in it as well. So Jason and I have known each other for quite some time. So I'm very happy for him to be here today, and thank you.
Thank you, Marco. And as I mentioned, thank you for all the sort of creativity that you've shared over the years.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna start with the first question. It's a question that I ask most of the participants in the Naviar Virtual events. So Jason, how did you start making music? What's your journey as a musician, as a creator?
It's really daggy, but I was really into music from a very early age. When The Empire Strikes Back came out, and I'm showing my age here, my aunt took me to see it, and they only had one ticket left. And so she was like, well, what else is screening at the cinema? And we ended up seeing the Village People movie. And it left me so energized. I was listening to the Village People for months afterwards, and all the disco. And then my grandfather bought me the Bee Gees soundtrack for Saturday Night Fever. So, upbeat music, dance music has been a passion of mine for a very long time now. And I loved music, and I loved dancing to it. I loved listening to it. I was one of those guys listening to the radio with the finger on the pause button, waiting for his favorite track to come on so he could record it. And for years, I was listening to all different types of music. I found that I really liked a certain energy in music. And as a result, I drifted quite across genres. I'm not very good at sticking within one area still. And it wasn't until I was about 15 that my cousin said, you know what, I bought a guitar. I'm thinking a guitar, and I'm thinking about forming a band, and you should join in too. What do you want to play? Do you want to play guitar, or maybe you want to play bass? And I was like, well, yeah, sure. And my cousin, he bought me this bass guitar, and I'd never thought that I could own an instrument. I'd never had that initiative to go out and buy one. But this really what led me into playing bass guitar. And I think from there, I've had this quite entitled sense of creativity, because I felt hell, I can have a go at anything. And I've come to the conclusion that music's too much fun not to have a go at doing. And so when we talk about some of my other projects, it really that entitled sense of, hey, I can do this is what leads into them.
Got it. Okay. So, well, you just said that you started from the bass guitar, basically. But one thing that strikes me right now is that when you, for example, when you submit a track to the haiku challenge, you play a lot of instruments right now. You're actually a multi-instrumentalist. I've seen you playing the drums, I've seen you playing the guitar, I've seen you playing the bass guitar. So how did this happen? How did you develop such a how did you become such a multi-instrumentalist?
Yeah, as I mentioned, that sort of sense of entitlement, I think, led me to think, hey, why don't I have a go at this? And what I found was once I picked up a guitar, it was a lot better a songwriting tool than like bass. You know, bass is great for coming up with a riff, but for a chord progression, it's better to have an instrument that it more naturally plays, you know, notes together in that way. And I guess the other thing is that my partner has encouraged me to pursue music. So every time, you know, I was in a job that I wasn't very happy doing and would spend like days or, you know, like sneaking off to like look on eBay and then saying, oh, I'm sorry, I bought another guitar. She'd be like, that's great. It's going to make you happy, right? And so, you know, I ended up with lots of instruments and, you know, once you've got them, you really got to start using them. Otherwise they sit around and make you feel guilty. So living in the country also, I mean, there's not a lot of people for me to call on to have a jam. So yeah, once I got down with the computers and was able to start multi-tracking instruments, it was about sort of playing the piece that I wanted, which is a lot simpler really than going out and trying to find a sample to manipulate to fill a particular spot that you want to, you know, for a song that you want to create. And one of the things that I think the Naviar haiku prompts has done for me is that it provides a regular deadline. And with that deadline, it's allowed me to sort of say, okay, what am I going to do to challenge myself? And so early on, like there was that piece that you mentioned, the number 17, was one of those ones where I said, okay, I'm going to challenge myself to come up with a single take, something that I'm not editing, something that I'm actually performing. And over time, you know, I've pushed the bar higher so that some of those tracks over the years have been like, you know, 3 single takes, one on the drums, one on the guitar, one on the bass, maybe 4 instruments at times. But it has been sort of been about, you know, the regular deadline is a sort of a case of going, okay, what is it that I want to have a go at recording this weekend? How's it going to meet the tone that the haiku sets? Or sometimes the haiku lends itself to, oh, you know, this kind of would be great to interpret. You know, certainly I think about some of the techniques that I've used do kind of relate more closely to the theme of the poem than others. Sometimes it's just good to have a deadline. Other times it really is about, I've got this idea about what's going to suit a response to that piece.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned 2 very interesting things. So the fact that sometimes it doesn't really matter what you have to do as long as you have a deadline. If you have a deadline, you just kind of prepare yourself, and you know that in 7 days you have to have a piece of music, right? And so you start thinking about it, you start processing it, and the fact that you have a prompt somehow gives you an idea of what you could make, but at the same time, most of the times artists struggle with infinite deadlines, unlimited time, so they keep reworking a piece of music indefinitely, and then they never publish it. And prompts like the haiku challenge or even the disquiet challenge, they help, because they say, okay, fine, this is the amount of time that you have, and your submission has to be ready before midnight, and that's it. And I'm glad to hear that this is something that helped you, that's been helping you, and it's something that other artists shared as well with us in the past. So it's really, really good, and I could see the results. Like you said, you started with maybe 1 take, and then maybe the week after you tried with 2 takes, and you got to 3, 4, and it's impressive. Some of the results are really impressive, and also the fact that you combine. Also, sometimes you combine field recordings too. So it really, over time, I saw your music evolving, and I could see that you, 1 week you would add something new or something different, or you would have a completely different approach. So you could go from a track with drums, guitar, and bass guitar, and then the week after you could make music You could make like an ambient piece or field recordings, or mix it with poetry even. I saw you doing that as well, and it's also included in the live set that we will see later. So it's really, really impressive. I have to admit.
Thanks. One quote I really like from Duke Ellington. He said, "I don't need time, I need a deadline." And I think that that's it. Like with a deadline, you can move mountains if you know you've got to focus on a particular sort of result at a point. And the other thing is that it takes the pressure off you in terms of that perfectionist impulse to get something perfect. You just know that you can get it in. And often, you know, these sketches, the first drafts that I submit, and I come back and sometimes polish them up and put them together on Bandcamp or whatever, and take the time to iron out some of the wrinkles, or, you know, change the instrumentation. And, you know, you mentioned the field recordings. The State of Origin exhibition was a great opportunity for that, because I knew that I had to share the sounds of my neighborhood. And I'd already sort of done a little bit of work with the contact microphones in the park down the street, and had some recordings of the galahs in the trees. And, you know, I was also bowing on the slippery slide. It was a big resonator. Yeah, so there was a sense of like, okay, what is immediately in my neighborhood that I want to share in this track? And the other great outcome for somebody based like in, you know, regional New South Wales, Australia, was to be able to say, hey, I'm part of an exhibition in London. You know, like it seems like a world away, because, well, it is.
Yeah, it is. It's I think it's the positive thing of being part of a online community. There are no boundaries really, and we have people. Well, Naviar has a relatively small community, but we have people from all around the world, and it's exciting to see what happens when artists from all around the world meet. Some artists decided to collaborate, so and some of them collaborate on a regular basis, or we've had the chance to have exhibitions as well, and we could gather music from 3 different continents, and it was impressive, and also humbling in a way.
Yeah, well, you know, that's a great reflection on the reach that you've cultivated, and, you know, the people who you found who are like-minded, and who have drawn an interest like in both directions.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I've learned so much through exploring different techniques through those deadlines, and also from the haiku. I've been introduced to a whole range of writers, and gained a sense of the depth of that tradition. You know, living in a country that's only a bit over a couple of 100 years old, to reading haiku poetry that's like twice as old as that is really humbling sort of material. Yeah.
I can imagine. But you mentioned something really interesting, because well, we talked about online communities, but you're also quite active in terms of offline communities, because well, back in 2017 when we co-curated, well, you did most of the curating process, and Naviar Records was involved as well. The exhibition Crossing Stream, which was well, it was about the local community, and it was about local identity mostly. And so I find it interesting that you can combine these 2 creative aspects of your artistic approach. So the fact that you're very active in online communities, and you're also active with local communities, and you're also a curator. So you're both a creator and a curator. Creator, and online and offline. So you really, yours is an all-encompassing creative lifestyle.
Well, you know, living in a small community gives me these opportunities to say, you know, I'll put my hand up and have a try at that. And Crossing Streams came about because I was working at a small community museum. And you might remember it was Pioneer Park Museum. I told you they had like an Italian museum.
Yes.
You were interested in. And so I had this kind of, I was already wearing the title curator, even though it was largely working with, items that the local community wanted to see preserved. And it was a community that was like, a little bit removed from where I am. So I kind of wasn't feeling totally connected to it. But as it was, the local regional arts board said to me, we're activating this space in Narrandera. It was a former Masonic lodge that the council decided would be a gallery, and they'd got a grant to fit it out. And so the regional arts board got a grant to pay people to put on exhibitions. And I think they probably thought that I was going to bring material from Pioneer Park Museum over to Narrandera to talk about the Riverina's history or something. Mm-hmm. But as it is, my mind started ticking over, what would be a lot more exciting for me if I got like all these people to like, from the communities I'm involved in to contribute material that I could share locally, because there's not a lot of people doing experimental music out here in the Riverina. And there was this great opportunity to have an international connection to trumpet at a time when it was a very sort of like, insular focus for the local community. And, Naviar gave this great platform to say to local writers, if you send in your haiku, musicians from around the world are going to interpret it. And I was at a writers group meeting earlier this year when the local librarian said, and Jason organized this great exhibition, and I had my poem interpreted by people. And she pulled out a laptop and she had the music there on her laptop, like without a prompt. She already had it carried around with her. And I thought it's really lovely to see that it meant something to her. Yes. And so it was a wonderful opportunity, and the diversity of the material that came in, it was so pleasing to see people take the time to put their headphones on and listen to the tracks. Absolutely. And it's a really gorgeous experience when you give somebody an opportunity to put on their headphones, because you see them getting transported. And when they close their eyes and their head tilts back a little bit, you've got them. It's like a hook in the corner of the cheek or something. It's great.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, I'm very happy to hear what you said about this this story about this poet and the interpretation that the Naviar community created for her for the work. So I'm really humbled too.
Oh, and you drew out a local composer to write a number of pieces, Fiona Kaldarovic. I struggle with her name. And, her musicianship is just phenomenal. Yes. And for the opening, she said to me, have you got a budget that I can pay some musicians to perform one of the pieces? And she found a cellist and a pianist to come along and play the piece live. Wow. It was really, it was quite incredible. I'll have to share the link with you, because it's recorded and online. Yeah, absolutely.
I would love to see that. And something that we briefly mentioned before, but another aspect of your creative lifestyle involves also poetry. And you're gonna share this with me and with the rest of the community now. But as we were talking before, you had some publications as well, and your passion and your interest in haiku started with a haiku challenge, and then developed to the point that haiku and poetry in general is part of your daily creative habit. Am I right?
Yeah, definitely. I'll dial it back a little bit. I think it was in 2001, I got my first mobile phone. I'd moved to Wagga Wagga. I didn't know anyone, and I got a mobile phone so that I could talk to people and not be too lonely. And the phone had SMS, and I thought, oh, this is really interesting, because I've always been interested in literal messages and writing. What could I do with this? And I thought, well, I could send people limericks, and I was like, yeah, limericks are a little bit weird. Why don't I write some haiku and send them out like broadcast style SMS? So that was one of the things that sort of started my interest in writing haiku.
Mhm.
And then when I took a year off in 2007 after the birth of my daughter to spend some time at home. You know, it's really lovely to be around as they're developing in that first year, as you'll discover. And I started writing some haiku to capture those sort of moments. And a little bit later, I got introduced to blogging, and I started sort of like posting like some blogging of haiku. And then through the Naviar, reading those prompts and thinking I should do more of this. In 2016, I challenged myself to write a haiku each week, and that was too easy. So in 2017, I said I'm going to write one each day, and I think that was probably one of the things that really sharpened the focus for Crossing Streams, because I was already doing a lot of writing of haiku, and thought I need to find some like-minded people to share this enthusiasm with. And that was another part of like that exhibition. And the good thing about like group exhibitions is that you do get this diversity of views and perspectives. And as a viewer, you get a wonderful sense of compare and contrast, because you get like to put things up against each other and get a sense of you know, how does this one relate to that? You know, that you've got a different relationship to the works, because you're immediately looking for, you know, particular patterns or resonances. And so the idea of a group show in 2017 also appealed to me for that. And from a marketing point of view, having a group means that you get a much bigger audience as a result, as they bring people along to show the outcome. And I'm sure your compilations, you know, speak to that. People are able to show them to their friends and say, have a listen to the work here. And it's a platform to then introduce people into other material. Absolutely. Also. Yeah. And, you know, that process led into an exhibition in 2019 called Earthwords and Soundscaping at the Griffith Regional Art Gallery. Because again, I knew I had a lot of haiku and photography to draw on as a visual thing to hold the walls. And then I put together like a variety of different clips from around the Riverina, and they were triggered by this MIDI keyboard. I don't know if you can see it. This is me with my niece, and I'm showing her like how you trigger the keyboard to get different videos. It was using Ableton Live, the MIDI mapping. And so it was really delightful, because that keyboard, you know, it attracted largely smaller people, and I knew it would like be irresistible for them to go over and press the button and then suddenly start seeing something, you know, pretty varied. Because you know, you mentioned about the diversity of the material I record, and so there was quite, you know, a range from field recordings through to you know, manipulated contact mic recordings that were more like dance pieces, prepared guitar being played by the wind. So yeah, there's all these different ideas for them to tune into. And again, that exhibition then traveled over to Wagga Wagga in 2020 at the Wagga Wagga Art Gallery, but that was just the soundscaping component. And by that point, COVID had hit, and they were like, yeah, we can't let you have a keyboard that we've got to clean every 15 minutes or whatever. But their technician had this idea of like setting up a sensor so that when people walked in the room, a random track played. And if they were still in the room, another random track played. And they weren't always the best, you know, pieces, but it just gave people that sense of, you know, an unpredictability, and created that engagement.
I remember this track that you made with the prepared guitar, and I just loved it. It was such a great idea. First of all, I remember there was the video as well. So you had the guitar on the side of the road, and whenever there was a car passing by, the guitar would make a sound, and the sound would change depending on the speed of the car, and also depending on whether it was a car or a truck, something heavier. It was incredible, really. It was something I I remember I listened to the piece and I watched the video and I thought, like, this is just a fantastic idea. It really makes you realize of how unpredictable the music making process can be, but it doesn't really matter your approach, but the result can always be fantastic. Also, when you let music kind of run wild, and that was a great example, really.
I do have to credit a French musician for introducing me to that technique, a guy named Garlo Joe. I think he's based in Bordeaux. He contacted me on Facebook because he'd seen the recordings I'd made of the large-scale Aeolian harp outside Wagga Wagga. And he said, I'm doing this project where the wind plays guitars, and this Aeolian harp is the same idea.
Mm-hmm.
And so he'd used this technique about 20 years earlier, and he was like revisiting it. But and this is a little digression, but I often find that older artists are a lot less precious about their ideas. And they're really wonderful people as mentors, because they know that even if you have the same gear as them, you're going to get a different result. Mm-hmm. They know they've got their own aesthetic, and they've got the confidence that somebody else isn't going to come along and steal it from them. So he was sharing this technique. He was approaching people around the world and saying, prepare a guitar, take it out in a windy spot and get this. And I'd made a number of recordings with him of like Aeolian harps and resonances using contact mics on fences. And when that poem came up from my friend Peter Vincent about this site outside Narrandera called Poison Waterholes, and it's got quite a grim background, because the story is that it was poisoned to kill off the local First Nations population. And so I wanted something that really, kind of witnessed the scene in a way that, like, listened to the environment. And I knew that a contact mic would go so far, but something that had a little bit more ambience, I guess, was like the idea of a prepared guitar. And so I tuned it to one of my favorite chords, E minor. And I was using what they call the Nashville tuning. So the lower guitar strings are using the same gauge as the higher guitar strings. Mm-hmm. So I put it out there, and I wasn't really sure what to expect, because my tests hadn't really produced enough wind. And even though I picked the windiest day in August, which is often a pretty windy sort of month, I wasn't sure I was going to get the right result. And then about halfway through that recording, it starts raining. And it was like these little arpeggios of droplets, like as they scattered across the strings. And so, yeah, it was totally magic for me as the listener, like sitting by the side of the road, as these trucks whiz past, getting this great result. And Garlo was so stoked with it too, which was also really pleasing.
Fantastic. I'm glad. I'm glad to hear that there was a story behind it as well. It's a very interesting story. And yes, there was another thing I wanted to ask you. Something that you mentioned but this is not about music. It's about haiku. You said that you first of all, you started and you were trying to you were writing haiku every week, every day for a week, and then you were not satisfied, so you tried to do it for an entire year. I'm interested in knowing how. What was your approach when you wanted to write a haiku? So were you because if you write, haiku is about inspiration, as we know. It's about a brief moment of our life, and we try to write down what we see and try to create a juxtaposition between what we see and our own kind of impressions of the moment, so to speak. But if you write a haiku every day, there has to be some sort of structure. There has to be some sort of approach that you have when you write a poem. So I was wondering, I don't know, Did you wake up early in the morning, sit down and start thinking, what am I going to write about? Was it something like this? Was it something that just struck you in the middle of the day? Was there an approach to your writing haiku?
Yeah, look, the advice they always give is that you've got to sit down and do the work, not wait for inspiration. So setting that regular sort of pattern of like writing was my way of like creating my own sort of deadlines to develop the material. And I was working over in Griffith at the museum at the time. So the drive over there was about, 40, 45 minutes, driving through the landscape and making observations, often looking for that sort of seasonal sort of reference, but also like might be the wildlife that you encounter, the fox that grins at you as he like cuts in front of the car, the bird that like sort of like the crow that just seems to know it just has to hop over the line so that it's not going to get run over. All these little sort of like vignettes. Actually, one really popular one was observing about how the grass seed got pulled off the stem by passing trucks. So I was always looking for these images, and there's one in the exhibition about how you see a piece of rope on the road and you have to give it a couple of looks before you realize it's not a snake. So it was about sort of capturing those little moments, and it did become a journal. And over time, you'd sort of file away something to return to at times. Other times it'd hit you while you were driving and you'd be trying to remember it all the way there so that you could like put it down at the other end. And and over time that practice has changed because I'm not driving as much all the time. In fact, for the last couple of years, I wasn't working and would be just getting up early in the morning and starting to respond to things that I'd read and looking for ways to summarize particular insights. And I think that's one of the other things I learned is that like the Senru approach of like a personal observation isn't necessarily like the seasonal reference. And the beauty of like digging into some of those haiku poets to understand that you're actually looking to capture specific feelings, the wabi or the sabi or the oneness. And some of those have been really great starting points because, English doesn't have words really to capture those atmospheres and those emotions and tones. And I think that is one of those things that language struggles with compared to music. Music isn't bound by the same sort of formal structure of having to find the exact right word to encompass a feeling. Whereas, sound, that you've got a whole palette of tones to draw upon, and how they rub up against each other can be nice or not so nice. And that's the emotion you get to work with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I understand. But somehow what you just said kind of makes me think about the connections between haiku and music, because in a way, it's true that it's very difficult to music gives you a wider spectrum in a way, because it's a personal process as well. Because I may, for example, I make music based on specific feelings and also based on my background, and I publish it, and you listen to it, and the way you listen to it is based on your feelings and on your background. So it's a the it's kind of music. It's processed twice in a way. So there is the composer, and then there is the listener, and with haiku poetry is the same, because it leaves so much room for interpretation that the reader might have something in mind, but the writer might have something in mind, but the reader might have a completely different approach and might look at it in a completely different way. And I think it's the fact that these are art forms that really allow the listener or the reader to fully reinterpret what they are experiencing and make it their own. Whereas this is not something. This is something much more difficult. For example, when you read a novel, there is a story. There are characters. Everything seems to be a bit clearer. But with haiku poetry, but with poetry in general, and with music, and with electronic or experimental music in particular, you have this sort of room for interpretation that opens up endless possibilities, I think.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, a lot of that writing, like novels, will be about trying to give the reader an insight into a character's frame of mind. Whereas, like something like poetry or music, I think it's about embracing ambiguity, because you want to create space for the audience to find their own meaning in there. And if it overlaps with your meaning, or if they're curious enough to find out what inspired the piece, then you can sort of work in that direction too. But I think that initial thing is about creating space for people to wander in and have their own experience. And like when I studied communications at uni, Stuart Hall had this model about how it's encoding the work, and then it's decoded at the other end. And sometimes the codec doesn't travel. Sometimes people get a different message.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Well, it's part of the game. It's a risk worth taking most of the times.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have just a couple of questions left for you. Well, first of all, I would like you. Well, in a few minutes, we're going to be listening to your live set, to the live set that you prepared for us. Would you like to tell us a little bit about it and introduce it to the audience?
Yeah. Let me tell you about the process. I went back and I downloaded 129 haiku responses that I've done for Naviar over the years. And then I also looked around and I said, what was I also doing at this time that isn't too prescribed, isn't too, doesn't carry too much meaning. So some of it was also about capturing some of those inspirations. There's a couple of spoken word pieces that aren't mine, and also some field recordings, some other prepared guitar recordings, and other material that kind of seemed to sort of align with what I was trying to do. And also the diversity of the material from Naviar meant that I had to make a decision about how I was going to reconcile some of those extremes. So a lot of the banging electronic tracks ended up getting left out. The surf rock material that I'd sort of played around with jamming here on my own. Also, I don't think there was too much of that ended up in there. But I was definitely thinking about like how Naviar had kind of given me an opportunity to share my landscape. And I love the idea of landscape being an internal psychological one as much as an environmental one. And I think that's one thing I've taken from reading Basho's work, is that, his narrow road that you recommended in the workshop I did really reminded me of that sort of road movie genre, where the physical journey through the environment is meant to mirror an internal process for the character, and possibly a process of thought for the viewer and the audience. So there was a real sense of bringing together a few of those different strands, and hopefully not giving anything too prescriptive in terms of meaning, but it was about sort of capturing some of that journey over the years that we've shared.
Fantastic. And thank you for mentioning the narrow road to the interior, which I think it's an absolute masterpiece. And for people who are listening this, The Narrow Road to the Interior by Matsuo Basho. It's a collection of haibun. The haibun, they both involve literature and haiku poetry, so it's a combination of things. I'm going to talk about it while Jason is doing other things, but it's really a fantastic collection of poetry, and it's the perfect introduction to haiku poetry as well. And obviously Matsuo Basho is probably the most interesting and most famous haiku poet. So it's one of the great haiku masters, and definitely The Narrow Road to the Interior is his masterpiece. So strongly recommended.
And I've been meaning to ask if you've read this book.
No, I haven't.
Because it got recommended to me when I went looking for The Narrow Road, and it's kind of a homage to that story.
Okay.
And it's by a German author, Marion Poschmann. But yeah, it's I think you'll enjoy it, because like I said, it's a homage, and it's still its own story, so it's quite a good read.
Okay, thanks. I no, I didn't read it. I haven't read it, and I didn't know the author either. So thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah, if you've got time for reading books at the moment.
I do. Don't worry. Don't worry. I always find the time, and sometimes, as you know, my daughter wakes me up at night, and I struggle to fall asleep again. So books are always a good thing for me.
Yeah, and reading aloud is a good thing for little kids too.
Definitely, yes, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. I tried with music already, but it didn't work out very well. I think it's too early. She's just 2 weeks old, so it's probably she needs a bit more time before I introduce her to music. And first I introduce her to easy listening, and then maybe in some 15 year time I'm going to introduce her to Naviar's music.
Yeah, my youngest was born at a time when I was going through a Duke Ellington fad, and he had like about 6 or 12 months of listening to all of that really intricate melody and harmony, and it's really interesting. He's got really good pitch. I think that was part of that foundation. Yeah.
Okay, all right. I'm gonna give it a try then. You can. That's good. That's good. I'm always open to suggestions when it comes to music for kids. So
yeah,
I'll keep that in mind. I have one last question for you, Jason, about future projects. If you have any, this is always something that I ask to artists that I interview. And yes, if you have future projects, if you have anything coming up that people might be interested in listening to or reading.
Yeah, out of the workshop that I did with you last year, I wrote a piece that was reflecting on the local river, and that idea that you can't jump into the same river twice. And so I think it was Heraclitus who sort of talked about time as being like a river. And I was really fascinated with the idea, because I thought about the way that rivers don't necessarily move in one direction. And our local river is known for having this silt worm that goes against the flow, so that the silt actually travels up the river, they believe. And I thought there was a really interesting idea about how people experience history, because your perspective is changing over time. And so I was having all of these philosophical thoughts, and I started working with that imagery. And having written haiku, I thought, well, it's really easy for me to work with those little short 17 syllable kind of like paragraphs to build up a series of vignettes and images and resonances. And I wrote this piece. And it was for a deadline for a local poetry prize, which I didn't win. But then I had the material, and I sent it off to an anthology that was looking for poems that respond to the environment. And in the next couple of months, I've got my first poem being published in an anthology, which is really exciting for me. And other projects, I've got a collaboration with a group called Real Artworks, who are based in northern New South Wales. And I was inspired through my travels to them to start my own Narrow Road to the North type journal. And the festival that we were working towards that was going to be happening in October has been postponed due to COVID. And they want to have an online sort of event while they're waiting for the opportunity to run the festival next May. So I'm trying to shape up this journal to give them, like, you know, a 2,000 word piece that they can put online that's like a reflection on the creative process with this group of differently abled artists who I've worked with over the years. And they've been fantastic collaborators, because the ringleader, Zeb, I've known for a number of years, and he really enjoys building the relationships and the rapport. So there's some really amazing musicians. There's one guy, Mike, who's got perfect pitch hearing. He's a blind pianist. And, you know, for me, tapping contact mics, it's wonderful to be able to hit something and then say, hey, what key is that one? And he'll tell you, oh, yeah, that's in F, you know. It takes out some of the guesswork. And so, yeah, we've done a few collaborations, and I'm trying to remember if any of that material ended up in this mix. But that's one project, both the writing and the festival next year, that I'm working towards. And there's a few other projects that I'm trying to wrap up, like in terms of grants that I got for local art projects. There's one exploring different bird species by understanding their diet through the shape of their beak. So we developed these worksheets aimed for kids to introduce them to the idea of habitat, what brings birds to the yard in terms of what food they're looking for. And so that's one I'm trying to wrap up. One other final one actually is one I just finished, and that was to create a soundtrack for a silent film called The Lost World. It's a film from 1925. It's a bit of a classic dinosaur adventure film. And I always wanted the challenge of coming up with a soundtrack to accompany a film. So I put in a proposal to do that as a grant project. And the screening nearly didn't happen because of all these COVID restrictions. But it's also something that I've got online. And I've got to say, it incorporates a number of tracks that were recorded as haiku prompts. Like, so once again, generating that material so that you can work it into other projects has been one great outcome from engaging with your regular deadlines.
That's fantastic. I'm really happy to hear that. I'm really happy to hear that you're keeping yourself busy. You really have a lot of things going on, and it's impressive, really. It's really, really impressive. All right, Jason. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed talking to you today.
Thanks, Marco. I'm really flattered by your interest, and I really have enjoyed like our collaborations over the years, and look forward to doing more work in the future. And all the best, at this time.
Thank you, and likewise. And now we're going to be listening to some of your music.
Fantastic.
Poetry can cure pervasive skepticism, know that language works. Prose for reflection, for self-fortification, to accept unrest. In quiet moments when a ringing fills my ears, I can sense a voice. In a voice I hear the conscious of my conscience, my intuition. The wind in trees sounds like a wave breaking on rocks in flow without ebb. Inside I am wet, with warm streams and raging seas and shifting currents. At the pool I swim somersaults until I lose sense of direction. Look up from below and see each breath rise to break out of the bubble. Time is uneven, passing slow underwater. Then fast before bed, sunrise again, and the chorus of birdsong is nature's alarm clock. This morning stood back and waited for me to rise before breaking dawn. Footprints in wet sand, glistening sea morning light, alone on a beach. Days keep slipping past. As I try to pin them down, they avoid deadline. The sparse still wait, with branches guiding me home. In whispers I know, with indecision I close my eyes and listen. How does my heart sway? Enjoy that it is, and forget what it is and why it is sometimes. As light breaks through clouds announced by the crowing birds, season is changing. Branches reaching up like flames from the star called sun, a small golden orb. Ghostly melody followed me into my day, fragment of a dream. Dreamed I found a boy after the end of the world. We hid together. Awoke feeling scared, dream of ghosts that make us sad in haunted houses. Me too, I might say, and can't shake those beasts from my bones, knowing not knowing. Sunlight beams through bricks, slipping through the zigzag cracks, light a crooked path. Flame embers that float high, spun into night onto smoke clouds, to dance among stars. Days are lengthening, somehow hours are shortening as time slips by, jarring dissonance between the idea and thing. It's disconcerting. Awake to birdsong, is it their chorus at dawn or restless full moon? Let's light a fire, then watch our world burn away, from ashes we'll grow. Bloom at your own pace, as Currajong trees blossom every other year, losing track of time as the year crawls to an end between holidays, watching lightning fall among dust-laden raindrops, awaiting thunder. As days flutter by, they must feel like full lifetimes to a butterfly. A thick rainbow arcs over my favourite gum tree, making my morning a high water mark in the form of a pale band circling the bark. composer explained that all his tone poems and symphonic sketches had been conceived and written within a few miles of his birthplace in one of the least populous quarters of the plains. He was trying to find the musical equivalent of the characteristic sound of his district. Strangers commented on the utter silence of the place, but the composer spoke of a subtle blend of sounds that most people habitually failed to hear. When his music was performed, the members of the orchestra were stationed far apart among the audience. Each instrument produced a volume of sound that could be heard only by the few listeners nearest it. The audience was free to move around, as quietly or as noisily as they wished. Some were able to hear snatches of melody as subtle as the scraping together of grass blades or the throbbing of the brittle tissue of insects. A few even found some spot from which more than one instrument was audible. Most heard no music at all. Critics objected that no one from the audience or the orchestra could hope to hear whatever harmony might have resulted from themes that were barely stated. The composer had always maintained in public that this was just as he intended, that the purpose of his art was to draw attention to the impossibility of comprehending even such an obvious property of a plane as the sound that came from it. But in private, and especially in the hotel where I spent the last hours before my journey, the composer regretted that he would never know what his works amounted to. During each rehearsal, he wandered all over the almost empty hall, hoping, quite unreasonably he knew, to hear from somewhere a hint of the whole whose separate parts he knew so well, that he was seldom aware of any more than the trembling of a single reed or string, and he almost envied those who heard the play of the wind across miles of grass as no more than a tantalizing silence. And to me, that really does speak about how it is to be surrounded by the beauty of the Australian landscape and to find inspiration in it and yet feel somehow thwarted when looking for ways to express musically what one hears.
Yet again rose the sun in headland, behind a wall of cloud. The faces of morning smiled to see themselves, going about each other's business in the front yard. Hot drinks in the gloaming upon the sofa, cloud light from the window, the computer screen at 40% brightness. An intruder auto-plays as she thumb scrolls her device, taking silence twice and causing fluster. Together they had watched the sun sails of the little cutting whose home is the portal east. Turned his face to watch the cloud light gather in the aura of tiny hairs and shine through the vein paths. And he had joked about its dumb filling of space, thinking about the commerce in repeated elements among art forms descended from advertising practices. Though his sigh was no joke, as his eyes drank the details of form, idea, and watched how it differentiated itself in every aspect, and made a beauty greater than most supposedly sensitive beings manage to produce, other than themselves. This little fan of the sun, this little fan of the sun, this little fan of the sun, somehow reaching inside me and telling the truth, how a kind word